I know it didn't come as a surprise to me, and as a result, I would hope it came as a surprise to absolutely not a single one of you out there that at last night's 2014 NBA Draft Lottery, the team with the worst record, the Milwaukee Bucks, did not end up winning the lottery and getting the number one overall selection. It shouldn't surprise you that the number two, the number three worst teams, they didn't get that first overall pick either. It ended up being the Cleveland Cavaliers yet again for the second year in a row and the third time in 4 years. And a little side note here, the team that's won the draft lottery the most all time, the Cleveland Cavaliers, with four of them: 2003, 2011, 2013, and here again in 2014. The reason it shouldn't surprise any of you is because the NBA draft lottery is stupid. It's a joke, and it needs to be dismantled and destroyed and pitched away from the NBA forever. It's 30 years of this crap now. 30 years of this hot freaking garbage. When is enough enough? I never quite understood why so much of the national sports media loved to kiss David Stern's ass so much. You know, David Stern, early in his tenure, did a lot of good things to help expand the NBA, both domestically and in particular. One of his greatest blueprints is his effect on the international growth of the game of basketball. But towards the end of his tenure, he did a lot of bad things that really hurt the NBA, both short-term and long-term. And one of his lasting achievements or lasting legacies that I think continues to be a stain on the NBA and just shows how bad for the league long-term David Stern really was, is the NBA draft lottery. Let's think about this for a second. In the NFL drafts order is determined very simply by one loss record. Major League Baseball, the same thing. Now, the NHL has a draft lottery, but frankly, in America, who cares about the NHL draft? I'm just being realistic here. So you look at the NBA draft. And I get the initial logic or thought process here. It's to attempt to prevent teams from intentionally tanking the seasons to reward themselves with the number one overall pick. Well, let's be honest. Even if you want to say that as a somewhat sensible logic, there is no guarantee by any stretch of the imagination that just because you end up with the number one overall pick, that in any way, shape, or form is going to be a game changer, an organization, a franchise changer whatsoever. More often than not, when you end up with the number one overall pick, you do not end up with the best player in that draft. And a lot of times, those players end up being big-time busts in the NBA. See Purvis Ellison in 1989 for the Sacramento Kings. See Joe Smith for the Golden State Warriors in 1995. That was a big-time organization changer, wasn't it? Oh, remember Michael Olowokandi in 1998 for the Clippers? You know, I could go on and on. Kwame Brown to the Wizards in 2001. Andrew Bogut to the Bucks in 2005. Andrea Bargnani to the Raptors in 2006. And Greg Oden to the Blazers in 2007. The point I'm getting at here is just because you end up with the number one overall pick, again, does not mean that you're going to end up being rewarded long term. So this whole notion of trying to prevent teams from tanking, well, fucking, if they want to tank, let them tank. Because chances are the reason they want to tank is because they've put themselves in a position to tank through their own stupidity and incompetence, and they're going to continue to be picking in that same spot year after year and never get any better any damn ways. So what does it really matter? This whole thing is just ridiculous, and it's just stupid. For years, people have talked about, all the way back to the first NBA draft lottery in 1985, how it's funny how certain years work out, and it's funny how this thing seems to play out better in certain situations for certain teams. Isn't it funny? Yeah, it's because the fucking thing is rigged more often than not. I can look back throughout the 30-year history of the NBA draft lottery and come up with at least, I think, a dozen examples of where I could point to this whole fucking draft lottery being one big sham and one big rig job. We start off with the first one in 1985. Patrick Ewing is the prize, and everybody knows it going into that draft. The New York Knicks have the third worst record in the league, yet magically, the New York Knicks, the largest media market in the country, the city where the NBA's headquarters are located, ends up getting Patrick Ewing number one overall. Imagine that. Were you trying to position it long-term because you knew what type of star Jordan was going to become long-term and you wanted to have a rival in that same conference? Probably. Did you want to have a big-time star like Patrick Ewing in the biggest media market in the country, the most important media market for your Basketball Association? Probably. Look at 1987. Some of you might say, well, why would there be any highfalutin shenanigans with David Robinson, the Admiral from Navy, going #1 overall to the Spurs, especially knowing he had a 2-year naval commitment to fulfill? Because the team with the worst record that year was the LA Clippers. And at that point in time, there was no way that a David Stern was going to allow one of his chief nemesises and arch rivals, Donald Sterling, to get his hands on a guy that David Stern again knew was going to be a big-time star in David Robinson. The Spurs had the 4th worst record that previous season, yet they end up getting the #1 overall pick and getting the Admiral. Look at 1992. Shaquille O'Neal was the big prize in that draft. Everybody knew it. The Magic only had the 2nd worst record that year. You're going to have Shaquille O'Neal go to the Minnesota Timberwolves? Nah, I don't think so. Shaq was going to go to the Magic. They wanted somebody down there in Florida, and that's what David Stern did. And then he followed that up the next year. The Magic only had the 11th worst record in the league, and I'll never forget this. I'll never forget this. When this 93 draft lottery happened, and I found out that the Orlando Magic, a team that just barely missed the playoffs that year, and I emphasize again, just barely missed the playoffs, had I think like a 41-41 record. They go from having the 11th worst record to getting the #1 overall pick, where the 2 big prizes in that draft that most people that watch basketball should have known was going to be #1, Chris Webber, and #2, Penny Hardaway. So, of course, you know, you've got Shaquille O'Neal there. You're maybe ramping up this team because you're getting ready after this next season to send the greatest player ever off on a sabbatical, you know, where I'll always say that he was saving the planet from basketball playing aliens, but in reality, an unofficial gambling suspension, if you will. So you needed to build up somebody in the Eastern Conference. Here's this great new star on the scene, Shaquille O'Neal. Why not give his team the #1 pick again and let them get somebody else to surround them? 96. The Grizzlies had the worst record, but that didn't stop David Stern from making sure that Philadelphia 76ers got Allen Iverson #1. Just think about that. 97. The Spurs had the 3rd worst record in that previous season, yet magically they're the ones that end up with Tim Duncan. So the Spurs tank a season because David Robinson's out for most of the year with a foot injury, and magically, here we go, Tim Duncan, David Robinson together, just like Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon in the 80s. The Twin Towers, oh boy. Look at the 99 draft. The Bulls actually in that lockout shortened season only had the 3rd worst record. People always think they were the worst team. They weren't. They were the 3rd worst team. Yet magically, because of the tank job and because Chicago was the 3rd biggest media market in the country and the 3rd biggest media market in the NBA, and they wanted to do some PR repair work here, they made sure the Bulls won the lottery and got Elton Brand, so that way Jerry Krause's dumbass could trade him away 2 years later for Tyson Chandler. 2002, Yao Ming. The Rockets only had the 5th worst record in the league. Yet magically you start hearing this stuff about Yao would prefer maybe to play in Houston. He liked the Asian population there. He thought it was a good fit for him. So the Rockets go from having the 5th worst record to being able to pick #1 overall. I mean, I could go on and on and on. The Cavaliers in 2003, it was them and the Nuggets that were tied for the worst record in the league. Were you going to send LeBron James out to Denver? I don't think so. What were you going to do? You're going to make sure he stayed in his hometown area, his hometown state. You're going to keep him there in Cleveland, Ohio, and make sure the Cavs got the guy. That's what they did. 2004, you might sit there and say, well, how, when the Magic had the worst record, how was it rigged? Well, based off of the history, more often than not, by far more often than not, the team with the worst record doesn't get the #1 overall pick. Isn't it funny that the Magic are sitting there with the worst record, and you've got the Bobcats coming in as an expansion team? Because, again, David Stern being the dumbass, instead of giving your expansion team the #1 overall pick and giving them a real franchise changer, he's going to make sure that the Magic get another big-time center to make up for the loss several years ago of Shaq leaving in free agency to go to the Lakers. 2008, my Bulls got touched by this rigging again. The Bulls had the 9th worst record in the league. And yet there's the Chicago area kid from Simeon High School who played a year at Memphis, Derrick Rose, on the board. And you had a feeling he might end up being the #1 overall pick. The Bulls, with the 9th worst record, win the freaking draft lottery and get the chance to draft the hometown hero, Derrick Rose. You look at 2011, Kyrie Irving going #1 to the Cavs, even though the Cavs, again, only had the 2nd worst record in the league. Why did this happen? Because of the big decision and LeBron leaving and taking his talents to South Beach. I have a feeling that there was some backroom agreements made between Dan Gilbert and David Stern that it's okay, we'll make sure we take care of you long-term for allowing this to occur. This will be good for the NBA short-term. Let us do this, and there you go. We'll make sure we take care of you. And now the Cavs have actually won the lottery 3 times in the past 4 years, and at no point in time in any of those seasons did they have the worst record in the league. So when you look at this, there are just so many things that come into play that make you say, oh my God, this thing is fucking rigged. You might not necessarily see it every single year, but at those key moments, those key times with those key players, with those key organizations, the NBA is the puppet master, and they make sure the ping pong balls fall where they may and where they need to. Here's some other interesting stats about how stupid this draft lottery is. No expansion team, when they've come into the league, whether that's the Magic, the T-Wolves, the Bobcats, the Hornets, the Heat, none of them were ever given the #1 overall pick from the jump. They were sitting there and always buried at like pick 4, pick 5, pick 6. How stupid and ridiculous is that? When the NFL brings a new expansion team into the fold, they give them the #1 overall pick. You know why you do that? Because that organization has nothing. And you need something for that new fan base to get excited about, to get behind, to be able to establish a future. And it just points to the stupidity of David Stern over the years to never have given an expansion team the #1 overall pick out of the jump. How stupid and how ridiculous is this? You can't sit there and say, well, it prevents them from tanking. Well, they didn't have a team to tank the previous season. You got to get them off the ground running in a new media market, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you think? 15 times in the 30 draft lotteries, 15 times, a team with a better than 3rd worst record in the league. So the 4th worst or 5th worst, 6th worst, 7th worst, 8th worst, 9th worst, 10th worst, 11th worst. 15 times a team outside of that 3 worst has gotten the #1 overall pick. Out of 30 draft lotteries, half of the time, if you were outside of the top 3, you got the #1 overall pick. How stupid and how ridiculous is that? That would be like in the case of the NFL to go like here. You sit there and say the 20 teams that don't make the playoffs all get entered into a lottery. And let's say the Arizona Cardinals, who finished 10-6 in 2013, just barely missed the playoffs, in part because they played in the much tougher NFC and they played a tough as hell NFC West division. The ping pong balls fall where they may, and then the Arizona Cardinals end up picking #1 overall, where they could get a Jadeveon Clowney. They could get a guy like Greg Robinson or a Sammy Watkins or a Khalil Mack. How does that make any freaking sense? Now you're punishing these teams that are already bad by helping them continue to be bad, and you're rewarding these teams that are pretty close for doing all right by sitting there saying, hey, we're going to help you get over the ladder even more. Here's another big freaking superstar you have no business getting your hands on. It's just absolutely ridiculous. 15 times, that is 5 plus 5 again. 15 times in 30 draft lotteries that a team that didn't have one of the 3 worst records in the league the previous season ended up getting the #1 overall pick. Only 4 times in 30 draft lotteries has the team with the worst record or tied for the worst record got the #1 overall pick. How stupid and how ridiculous is it? It is time for the NBA to abolish this piece of crap. It is time for the NBA to crumple this up and throw it in the basket of memories and say it is gone, never here again. This is one of these legacies of David Stern that needs to be eliminated and gone from the NBA consciousness and lexicon forever. Why? Because if you don't, you will continue to see stupid shit like this, where teams like the Milwaukee Bucks have the worst record in the league, and they end up not getting the #1 overall pick. A team like the Cleveland Cavaliers, for the 3rd time in 4 years, ends up with the #1 overall pick. And at no point in time in any of those 3 seasons where they won the draft lottery did they have the worst record in the league. And how does that make any sense at all that the team with the 9th worst record in the 2013-2014 NBA season has the #1 overall pick? I know it sure as hell didn't make any sense in 2008 when my Bulls ended up winning the lottery so they could get Derrick Rose. It made sense because the fucking thing is rigged, and that's what this whole thing is. It's one big rigged piece of garbage. It's about high time the NBA stops this shit once and for all. Start acting a little more like the NFL. You know, where the NFL, they tell players you can't come to the league until you're 3 years removed from your high school class. Of course, David Stern in the NBA, we're only going to make you do 1. And look at the quality of the product now. And look at the quality of the product with the draft lottery system like this. What a bunch of trash.